Hey kids, welcome to Rob's Red Hotspot and a new tutorial video series on Hearts of Iron 3, their finest hour. You might be asking yourself why I would make an Ahoy 3 tutorial in 2020, and I have a few answers to that question. First of all, Hearts of Iron 3 is a very complicated game, and part of that complexity is really makes the game richer in certain ways than Hearts of Iron 4, certainly in terms of historical simulation. Especially if you get into modding the game. If you start playing like Hearts of Iron 3 with Black Ice, for example, I would say that is, to my knowledge, the most complex simulation of World War II ever created. Certainly more so than Hearts of Iron 4. Even if you start modding Hearts of Iron 4, Hearts of Iron 3 still takes the cake in terms of the level of detail. But that level of detail is what makes the game complicated. We'll talk about different aspects of that, things like the order of battle and the supply system, the AI control options, all those elaborate features. Some of them are that's what people love about the game. It's also what people hate about the game. It's what makes the game hard to learn how to play. And so I'm going to try and go through a lot of those mechanics kind of one by one in a somewhat systematic way, and for new players or even intermediate players who've never understood certain aspects of the game, I'm going to try and go through as many of those concepts and mechanics as possible, so that to make the game more approachable. Because I think it's a great game and it's absolutely still worth playing in 2020. Obviously, I'm playing Hearts of Iron 3 version 4.02 with all of the DLCs, and I would advise getting all the DLCs. They should be cheap on Steam. You should be able, especially if you find a sale. Even if you don't get them on sale at this point, the game is pretty cheap, and you should get a complete edition of it, probably on Steam. I know that for Mac you can get it on the App Store, and I used to play Hearts of Iron 3 on a Mac at one point, and I'm not sure if they have released a 64-bit version of it though. So if you have a super recently produced Mac, you may not be able to play this at all, unless you use Boot Camp or something like that. Right. So Hearts of Iron 3 also, another difference between it and Hearts of Iron 4 is that it follows history a little bit closer, and you're not given options to, I don't know, turn fascist as the United Kingdom quite as easily. It's not really set up for a sort of Europa Universalis type of gameplay, and it's a little bit more realistic historically in that sense. If you start modding the game, there are alternate history mods. There you can really play the game any way you want. There are mods that turn the game into more of a sandbox, and there are mods like Black Ice that make the game even more faithful to history, and that make it even harder to deviate from what happened historically. So lots of different ways to play the game. Despite some of the restrictions in this game, because of mods and just because of the game mechanics, there is a lot of freedom in terms of what goals you choose to pursue. And that brings me to the kind of guide that this is going to be, the kind of tutorial that this is going to be. I am going to assume that you are playing. Well, first of all, we're going to be talking about vanilla Hearts of Iron 4 here, vanilla with the DLCs, but without any mods. I'm going to assume that you're playing on normal difficulty. Some of the tips that I'm going to be giving you and can certainly be used to increase the difficulty to hard or very hard, if that's something you're interested in. This is not going to be a min-maxing guide. I'm not going to tell you the absolute. I'm not going to try and argue the absolute best way to play the game. Depending on what your goals are, there are certain strategies that will allow you to do something like take Finland and conquer the world with it. This guide is not geared towards that. Once again, some of the concepts and mechanics and strategies I'm going to be giving you can certainly be used to pursue that kind of goal. I would recommend checking out Marco Antonio's Hearts of Iron 3 videos if you want to see a player who has truly mastered the min-maxing of the game and who can do something like take a country like Finland and Ethiopia and make them very powerful, or even try and conquer the world. But I'm going to assume that you're mostly going to play the game in a fairly sort of as intended out of the box. And I will touch on some of the exploits that you can use if you want to exploit the AI. But once again, it's really up to player choice. There are certain units in the game that some people would consider pretty useless, like so things like is it worth it building submarines at all? That's really open for debate. The answer to that question is going to depend on whether you want to role play the game historically, whether you want to simply pursue, make your country as strong as possible, and things like that. So I'll briefly mention them, but it's not the focus of this guide is not going to be to. I'm not going to argue what the absolute optimal way to play the game is. I'm just going to try and explain the mechanics so that you can choose what mechanics you want to focus on and play the game in. I would also say that if you are playing on normal difficulty as a major country, you don't need to min-max. It's not necessary to min-max to have an enjoyable experience and have a certain amount of success. You won't necessarily win the war. Do something like, say, taking Italy and controlling all the Mediterranean and defeating the Soviet Union. All of that is possible. Should be possible for you if you practice the strategies and skills that I'm going to focus on in this guide. When you first launch the game, when you first install the game, you may be greeted by this screen, where it gives you an option basically between these different scenarios and a tutorial. I wouldn't bother with any of that. These scenarios are not particularly well put together. They were introduced at an earlier stage, and as the game got DLCs and different mechanics changes, they're a little bit buggy and weird, especially the tutorial. So you're going to want to click that custom start button. I'm going to assume you're playing single player. Some of these strategies could be used in multiplayer. I will mention some multiplayer specific strategies as we go along, and who knows, maybe down the line I'll make a multiplayer tutorial. I have done a little bit of multiplayer in this game. Certainly, obviously, when you're playing against human opponents, the strategies you use are going to change. Feel free to try these later start dates. They don't work as well as the 1936 start date, and I don't necessarily recommend them for a first playthrough. Starting in 1936 gives you a lot of time to set up your country, whereas in some ways the Blitzkrieg scenario is the most historically realistic, but the Blitzkrieg scenario was created for an earlier version of the game, and there are some strange diplomatic things that happen and weird bugs. The game plays a little bit strangely when you load up one of these dates. Certainly feel free to experiment with them, but most of the tips I'm going to be giving you are going to assume that you're starting with a 1936 start date. There's also the scenarios option here. These are kind of weird as well. I don't usually play with these, and like I said, feel free to poke around in these and see what they do, but I have not found them to be that enjoyable. This custom game allows you to change your country's neutrality and various things, and I'm not going to recommend that you play on a custom game either. Feel free. It can be a lot of fun to do things like, play as the United Kingdom, but as a very belligerent United Kingdom that declares war on Japan in 1937 and things like that. It certainly can be a fun way to play the game. It tends to make the game easier, especially if you have a good understanding of production and technology and what units are good and what units are not worth building. This will tend to make the game easier. Because you're able to just only pick, you're able to just use all of give yourself advantages that you will not get in a historical start. So we're going to focus on the 1936 historical start. So what countries are interesting to play as? Well, let's start by talking about the 8 major countries. This guide will I would recommend for a beginner player that you pick one of the 8 major countries, and I'll talk about which ones are the best choices. So the 8 major countries, you've got the United Kingdom, Germany, the United States, the Soviet Union. You've got France, Italy, and Japan, and those are those are the flags down here. I think most players consider nationalist China to be a major country as well. Nationalist China obviously needs a little bit of work at the beginning to cement its position as a major power, but it can fairly easily be turned into a major power, and very, very interesting country to play as. I wouldn't necessarily recommend it for a first playthrough, but it's basically a major power in a lot of ways. So which of those 8 should you pick if you are going to pick a major country, which I recommend? I would avoid the United States. I would avoid the United States. Certainly, it's a very easy country to play as, but it's also a fairly boring country to play as because you're only going to join the war most likely in 1941, or certainly a lot later than other countries, and it's going to be a long, slow start to the game, and you're not going to be able to see the impact of the choices you make. So, by all means, play as the USA if you want to, but maybe not the best way to learn the game. Soviet Union has a huge army and involves a huge amount of micromanaging. There are things you can do to manage the Soviet Union, but it would certainly be a challenging first choice. But a good choice, a very interesting choice. In terms of strategies, I'll talk about specific strategies like defense in depth. I'm going to do a whole video on that. So, but the classic choice is Germany. That's what a lot of people like playing. And Germany is certainly a fun country to play. I would highly recommend, though, playing as the UK, France, Italy. Japan is quite challenging. Really any of the major countries. There are a few minor countries that are also interesting to play as. Probably not for a first playthrough. Probably better once you've gotten a little bit more experience with the game. So minor powers, I can mention a few now. Minor powers that can be interesting to play. In terms of traditionally allied countries, Canada is an interesting. You can turn Canada into an industrial powerhouse. Australia is an interesting country to play as you can defend against the Japanese and contribute to the Allied war effort in the Pacific and East Asian regions. In terms of the traditionally Axis countries, Romania is a really interesting choice. Romania controls a lot of oil and can contribute a lot to the Axis war efforts. Yugoslavia can go either way, Axis or Allied. Traditionally, they would be an Allied country. Republican Spain is an interesting minor country because of the Spanish Civil War. So that actually is not a bad country to start playing as fairly early on if you want to get familiar with the combat system, and you start the war basically right away. You can tag switch and play as the fascists if you wish. Very challenging country to play as in a number of ways. Other regional neutral powers: Brazil, Argentina, Turkey, Sweden. These are countries that can become fairly powerful, but that start the war neutral, and that we're not majorly involved in the war historically, but certainly they can become interesting countries. Persia also potentially. Persia could be in Saudi Arabia. But I would say overall that the trouble with playing in the unmodded game, the trouble with playing any of these minor powers is that there's a limited amount that you're going to be able to do. Unless you get into some pretty serious min-maxing, it's not going to be easy to have a huge impact on the war. If you're playing as Canada, for example, you simply do not have enough manpower to conquer the world unless you do some kind of strange shenanigans in terms of min-maxing. Anyway, so let's load up let's load up a country here, and we're going to start to talk about some of the basic concepts, provinces and resources and things like that. I'm gonna try and avoid using Germany to demonstrate in this guide as much as possible, and the reason for that is that Germany is by far the most popular country to play in Hearts of Iron, both Hearts of Iron 3 and Hearts of Iron 4, and there are so much of the information that is on the forums and in existing tutorial videos is geared towards playing as Germany. So there's just so much information out there about and strategies for Germany that I'm going to try and focus on some of the other major countries. I'm going to load up France for now. France is a great country to play as. Really difficult in some ways, but it will force you to set up your country as quickly as possible and defend against Germany and try and survive. And I think it's would be a great first country to play as. They also have a fairly short front. They don't need to engage in a huge amount of overseas naval stuff, so that takes a little bit of the complexity out of the game, and really you can focus on just defending these short fronts, with your Air Force and Army. and you know, could be a very, I would argue France is a great country to play as first. Germany obviously is an interesting choice, but with Germany, the early game is going to be very easy, and it's the late game that's going to be challenging when you're fighting the Soviet Union and trying to deal with the United Kingdom and eventually maybe even the United States. So certainly Germany is a great country to play as. France is, I would argue, maybe an even better country to start for a beginning player because you know, you can sort of, you have a little bit less variables to work with. Right. So we've loaded up France here. Let's start by talking about provinces and the resources that they contribute. If we click on a province here, we can see that they contribute all of these resources. Let's go through each one of those resources one by one first. So one of the most important resources in the game is industrial capacity. Industrial capacity is what you use to build things. We'll get more in detail about, you know, what you use in industrial capacity for later, but it's very, very important. You can see here how much industrial capacity your entire country has. So you can see the base IC, and the base IC is basically every province. You can see here that Paris, for example, has 9 IC. IC comes from provinces. I believe you get a base of 5 plus the sum of all of the provinces in your empire, and that's what the base IC number represents there. And there are a number of modifiers that either increase or decrease that IC, and so your available IC is your base IC with the modifiers applied. Wasted IC is just IC that you haven't used, and obviously we have 25 wasted IC right now because we haven't put very much in the production queue and we haven't used these sliders. So there you go, that's IC. Leadership. Leadership also comes from provinces. You can see it here. And leadership is, you can see the total for your country in the technology screen. Leadership is used to do research, espionage, diplomacy, and officers, and we'll talk about these 4 shortly. Manpower. Manpower, you can see the total for your country up here, as well as your monthly gain. Manpower is what you need to field an army, and you know, and also to reinforce an army. If you take losses, you need to spend manpower from your manpower pool and put it on the map. If we look at an individual division, let's find a regular division. Here we go. Troisième division d'infanterie nord-africaine. There we go. We've got this division here. You can see that each one of these infantry brigades is 3,000 manpower. A regular brigade. Also, your planes and ships take up manpower. You can see that actually, if you look in the production screen here, the manpower cost of various units. I'm not going to get into detail about the production screen here, but that's the best way to see naval and air units, how much manpower they consume. Right. So now let's talk about the physical or raw materials that are on the map. So if we click on a province, we can see these 4 here. We can also see the total for the entire country. This is your total stockpile up here. And by hovering over this, we can see whether we have, if it's green, we have a surplus, and if it's red, we have a deficit, and we can see the daily change. And I'll get more into detail about converted and used and all these things as we go along. But yeah, so let's focus on the first 3: energy, metal, and rare materials. These are the 3 resources that are consumed by industrial capacity. So for every unit of available IC, you need 2 energy, 1 metal, and 0.5 rare materials. Just to avoid confusion, I've seen a few people post things on the forums or even in videos. There is a misconception that, for example, if you're playing as the UK and you build a lot of ships and planes, that you need a lot of metal because you have a lot of ships and planes and they're made of metal. That is not how this works. That's not how this works. These simply are used to power your IC. They're consumed by IC. If your stockpile hits 0, and you're not gaining any of these resources, you get a huge penalty to your IC. Your available IC goes way down. So So I believe it's a 50% penalty, but the exact number doesn't matter. Just know that if you run out of these, you're going to be in deep trouble. Crude oil. Crude oil is produced in provinces as well. I don't think there actually is a province in the French don't have any crude oil provinces. Let's find a crude oil province here in the Middle East. There's a British crude oil province. You can see it produces 4 crude oil there. Crude oil is not used directly for anything. It has to be converted into fuel before it can be used. Depending on your technology and other factors, your ability to refine crude oil into fuel and the efficiency with which you do that is important. But we'll skip that for now. Money. Every country basically starts with a base income, and that is modified by ministers and laws and various other modifiers. We can see like massive education investment and things like that. Money is not the most useful resource in Hearts of Iron 3, and that is fairly historically realistic in the sense that, you know, once World War II got going in earnest, if you look at the arrangements between, say, the USA and the United Kingdom, the USA basically, in a variety of ways, wrote the UK a blank check. Paying for weapons and things like that became less and less of an issue when the countries were basically got together and decided that they were going to fight the war and do whatever it took to defeat Germany. So that's represented fairly well in the game. In the early game, money will be important to buy resources and do things like production licenses and pass laws, but the more as the game goes on, money will become less important. You're able to do things like allow debt between countries. So it's obviously important to have a certain amount of cash flow, especially early on. You will want to have a certain stockpile of money to be able to do things like trade agreements, especially early on. But you do not win this game by getting rich. And if you're, you also do not lose the game by being completely broke. You could be completely broke, and as long as you have the resources that you need and you're able to have trade agreements with countries and things like allow debt agreements between countries, you could win this game and be sitting at 0 income like indefinitely. So just a good general thing to know about money. We'll talk more about that when we talk about trade. So first of all, let me just show you a few ways that you can view the resources in your country. So I already briefly showed you the resource map mode. The resource map mode is very useful to get you. It's good to get to know the resources around the map in your country and in other countries. So we can see the green provinces indicate where there's at least one IC in the province, one industrial capacity. The brighter green indicates more IC. So we can see here like Birmingham has 10 IC, a maximum of 10 IC. Sheffield, Paris has 9 IC. We can, if you look at the little resource icons, that indicates a province that produces at least a fraction of a resource. So we can see that Auxerre here produces 10 energy. We can see that Paris produces a little bit of everything except for crude. And yeah, so that's what you're able to see on the resource map mode. If you want to get to know your country when you boot up in the game when you start a new country, it's also worth clicking on this economy tab here. You can you can sort the provinces that you control by metal, rare materials, oil, manpower, and leadership. If you want to see what provinces contribute IC, you go to the buildings screen and you can sort the provinces here. This is very useful. All of this interface is very useful to get to know your country, and certainly when you're thinking about your kind of grand strategy for the campaign, you may want to focus on conquering provinces that give you IC or give you resources, especially if you're playing a resource-starved country like, say, Japan. I'll talk briefly about strategic resources because they are somewhat important. They were added, I believe, with one of the DLCs. I can't remember which, but you've got, if we go here, we can see the list of them here, 17 or 18 or something. Anyway, these different resources, if you find them on the map, you can see what they do. So casualty trickle back from antibiotics, ball bearings contribute to repair speed, aluminum contributes to air build speed. You know, refineries in particular are very important. So you can see those on this resource map as well. So capturing provinces with the oil refineries. Now, if you control one of these provinces, you get the bonus for your entire country, and all of your allies, all of the countries that are aligned towards your faction, also share that bonus. So, for example, Canada produces uranium. So if Canada is in the Allies, any allied country will do nuclear research 40% faster. Norway has heavy water, which gives the same bonus. So, it can be advantageous for the Axis to control this province in Norway, because then they'll get faster nuclear research, and there's all these. That's how these bonuses work. There's various ways to get these bonuses, but either by taking the provinces or by using diplomacy. We'll talk about that more later. Let's talk. There's a few other aspects of provinces that I want to mention. You've got cores. Like every Paradox game, there is a core mechanic in Hearts of Iron 3. This is not a game where you're going to gain a lot of cores, and cores are going to kind of the cores are pretty much fixed from the start, with a few exceptions. There are a few events that give you cores, especially as the Axis. There are a few events that give you cores in different territories, and that allow you to take your cores with war goals and things like that. But this is not if you start as, say, France, you're never going to have a core on, a province in Romania. It's not like Europa Universalis 4. The cores are pretty much set from the start, and they do have an effect on things like revolt risk. But just so you know, there is a core mechanic. There are a few instances of kind of contested claims. So, for example, Hong Kong, nationalist China, communist China, and the Guangxi clique have a claim on Hong Kong, as well as the United Kingdom. There's these other provinces here. China has cores on provinces in all over the place. I can't see it right now because we're playing as France. France doesn't have any cores overseas, or doesn't have any, unclaimed cores. Basically, it doesn't have any cores in other countries that it hasn't conquered. But if you were to play as nationalist China, you would see that nationalist China has cores you'd see like a hatching over these provinces. You'd be able to see that nationalist China has cores on all of these Asian minor countries. We can click around and we can see that here as well. So we can see that nationalist China has cores all over the place. There are also some contested cores in the Balkan region. Just another example. Italy has some cores in Yugoslavia. Bulgaria has some cores in Yugoslavia. I believe. No. Anyway, you can get to know this. You can get to know this as well. There are a few little historical things in here. The cores don't have a huge effect on the game. There's also unformed nations like, say, Israel, that have cores here, and Jordan and Palestine. Yeah, there we go. Lebanon. So it's a good mechanic to know about. It's not one that is the most elaborate in this game. If you play Hearts of Iron through with mods, there are mods that kind of expand the core system and give it a little bit more, kind of flesh it out in various ways. Another important thing to note about provinces, there is a penalty for overseas provinces. So overseas provinces don't contribute as much manpower and leadership, etc. I'm not going to give you the exact statistics and everything, and it's a little bit of a weird trying to understand how this monthly manpower gain is calculated and how your exact leadership is. There's a lot of modifiers, some of which are visible and some of which are not. But it's just important to know that if you're taking territory overseas, you're not going to get the full benefit of that, and there's really nothing you can do about that. That's it's something. There are mods that change it, but there are mods that change that penalty and reduce it or increase it. But it's an important mechanic to know about. The same goes for occupied territory. Occupied territory is going to have a penalty to the resources that the territory contributes to your country. You're able to change that with your occupation policies, which will appear here once you've occupied territory. So at some point I'll show you guys this screen. but it's just a good thing to know, occupied territory. And occupied territory also affects revolt risk, which increases. There is a revolt risk map mode here. You know, you do get rebels in territory that you've conquered, and you can basically pass policies to trade. To extract more resources from the areas that you've conquered by essentially repressing them, in exchange for more revolt risk. So that's that. This map mode here, the resource map mode, is very useful when you're planning what areas you might want to conquer and what areas you might want to defend. For example, if I'm playing as the United Kingdom, this island is probably not worth defending, right? It contributes, what, 1 metal. So that's probably not worth deploying a garrison and, you know, air units and things like that. It might be worth defending if you want to use it as an air base, for example. You know, it might be worth defending tactically, but in terms of resources, probably not. By comparison, if we look at the Malay Peninsula, Peninsula contributes rubber, which is huge. So this is an area that may very well be worth defending against the Japanese as the United Kingdom, for example. It also produces a huge amount of rare material. There's enough rare materials in the Malay Peninsula to provide, you know, Japan with all of its rare materials, basically. So that's, you know, that would be a good target for expansion if you're playing as Japan, and a very important area to defend if you're playing as the United Kingdom. Borneo also has crude and rare materials and things like that. So you know, it's good to get to know the resource map, get to know where resources are, both when you're trying to conquer a country and when you're trying to defend your empire. There is a certain amount of information that you're able to see by clicking on foreign provinces. You can see information on provinces that are in your faction, but as France, if I look at these German provinces, if I hover over these, I can see what the base numbers are, but I'm not able to see the exact quantities. If I have with espionage, you get a little bit more detail in the screen. We'll talk about espionage more in detail later. You can also see the infrastructure level, but we'll talk more about infrastructure later as well. But if I click on this province, I know that there is IC in Dortmund. I don't know how much though, and the same goes for these. We don't know what the modified numbers are for these resources, but we also don't know. We don't know whether the province contributes manpower, and leadership and all that. That pretty much covers resources and provinces. Now let's talk about what you use those resources for. So we can start with production. So one of the things that production is used for these 6 things essentially. Upgrades. We'll just go through them in order. Upgrades, when you research new technologies, you have to spend IC to upgrade your units. So if you want to see what you're able to upgrade in a unit, for a land unit, click on the brigade here. Click on the actual brigade, not just the division, and you scroll down, and all of the things in yellow down here are things that will upgrade. But you have to spend IC to put those to send out those upgrades, basically. So the more technology you research, the more IC you have to spend on upgrades. And there are trade-offs to be made there. If you want to see, the same goes for air units and naval units. Click here. One important thing to note is that naval units, only certain things can upgrade on ships. You can't upgrade the main armament or the engine or the armor of ships. You can, however, upgrade. These are doctrines. We'll talk about doctrines later. But you can upgrade the anti-aircraft armament. You can upgrade the radar. Let's find a submarine. Submarines you can upgrade torpedoes, sonar, and this air warning equipment, as well as you can get these more advanced torpedoes later and stuff like that, as well as anti-aircraft. So there you go. That's upgrades. Reinforcements. As I mentioned here, if we look at, here we can take, I looked before at this, this is a regular division, a division made up of regular brigades. So we can see that its strength is full, and it's using 300 manpower. When a unit is, this is a reserve, you can tell by the little exclamation mark there, a reserve brigade only has part of its strength, and when you either press the mobilize button or you are at war, these reserve divisions or reserve brigades will be mobilized. And mobilizing is going. You're gonna spend IC for reinforcement. You're also going to reinforce brigades that have been damaged, that have taken casualties in combat, and the same goes for aircraft. Also repairing ships. If your ships are damaged, it's the reinforcement slider here that sends repairs out to your ships and aircraft and replenishes your units, and is also used when you mobilize. So that's fairly important to know. Let's talk about supplies, and I want to talk about fuel at the same time. I'm not going to explain the whole supply system right now. I'll probably make a whole video or a whole section of a video just on the supply system because it's very complicated in this game. But suffice to say for now that supplies are produced by IC. And you can research a few technologies to make supply production more efficiently, and you can also distribute supplies more efficiently over your territory as you get better at logistics and as you build infrastructure and things like that. There are ways to get more bang for your buck in terms of how much IC you need to spend producing supplies. Every unit on the map consumes supplies, just like every unit on the map consumes manpower. So we can see that here. We can see how much this division consumes there, and the same goes for fuel. Some units consume fuel. For example, air units. Oops. We can see here that this air unit consumes 10.55 fuel every day. These three tactical bombers. An important thing to note is that these HQ units also consume supplies. They don't consume fuel, and it also takes manpower. So the more HQ units, the more complex your order of battle is, the more manpower and supplies your army will consume. Although there are, I'll talk more about the order of battle in detail later time. I'll probably do a whole video just on the order of battle and how to optimize, how to make the best use of your HQ units. And how to get the best bonuses without spending huge amounts of resources. So that's supplies. That covers off supplies and fuel. Fuel, just a reminder, is produced from refining crude oil. Supplies are produced directly by your IC. So you do need to, a certain part of your IC is always going to go towards producing supplies. So one of the ways you can increase your IC, especially early in the game, is to reduce the supply consumption needs of your units. Production is the stuff that you can, we can put in the production queue here. The next video I'm going to make is going to be all about production, so I won't get into too much detail about it, but basically anything I place in the production queue increases our needs for production. And it's, generally speaking, you want to put as much IC as possible into production and upgrades and reinforcement, obviously. So you want to be reducing how many supplies you need to produce in consumer goods. Let's talk about consumer goods briefly. Consumer goods are needed based on the number of regular brigades and mobilized reserve brigades. So mobilizing during peacetime is very costly because we don't need to produce consumer goods for this division. We do, however, need to produce consumer goods for this division because it's a regular division. You can see there's no exclamation point there. So you don't really want to mobilize during peacetime, generally speaking. The amount of consumer goods that you require is also affected by these laws. So we'll probably look at these laws very soon. And yeah, so consumer goods basically don't give you any benefit if you do not have enough consumer goods. Your dissent will increase here, and we'll talk about dissent later. But basically, you absolutely need to produce at least I mean, you need to produce exactly the amount of consumer goods that your country needs, and you can take various steps to reduce this. This is basically, this IC doesn't give you any benefit. It just prevents a negative modifier with dissent. Dissent is really bad. You never want any dissent. And you also can't stockpile consumer goods, so there's no point of producing more consumer goods than you need. So generally, you just want it to be sitting at the exact value that you need. Lend-lease. Lend-lease is something you can do where, with your allies, with countries that are in your faction, or that like you enough, essentially, you can either receive or distribute Lend-lease to other countries, and that all that does is it transfers your IC, and this is something that the United States will be doing a lot of. You could potentially do it as other countries as well, but the United States will be giving a lot of Lend-lease to the allied countries once it joins the war, and even before it joins the war. So that covers off all of the different ways that we use production, that we use IC. Let's talk about leadership and how you spend leadership. Obviously, when you produce things, when you produce things and when you reinforce units, you are converting manpower into an army on the field. So that's how manpower is put to use in the game. Let's talk about leadership, though. So leadership can be used for research, espionage, diplomacy, and officers. Every point of research will allow you to research one project, which you can see here. And these projects take a varying amount of time. We'll talk more about research later. If you hover over this, you will see how many spies, when you hover over that actual slider, you'll see how many spies you gain per unit of leadership. So if I actually hold control and I click on this, it'll kind of round it to 1. It's a little bit wonky, but see there I can get, I can add 1 point, and I can see that I get 0.15 spies daily for 1 point of leadership. Diplomats are a little bit cheaper. You can get 0.5 diplomatic influence or diplomats for every day for 1 point of leadership. And officers, you can see here exactly how many officers you produce, and depending on your laws, you'll be able to produce officers more and more efficiently. But the larger. So let's talk about each one of these individually briefly. So research is pretty self-evident. You use it to research projects, and generally speaking, you want to be putting as much leadership as possible into research, almost without exception. Spies are very important, though. I'll get into more detail into espionage later, but spies are used to protect your country from enemy spies. They're used to support your ruling party and prevent your ruling party from losing an election or being replaced by another party. Not something you have a huge influence on in the game, especially if you're a democracy. They're used to raise your national unity, and we'll talk about national unity afterwards. And they're also used to spy on the enemy and reveal what's in their provinces. They're used to potentially steal technology. You can use it to try and influence the political situation in foreign countries. You can disrupt their national unity, which will make them surrender faster, and you can increase their threat, and we'll talk about that later, and these covert operations we'll talk about later as well. Diplomats are used for all of these diplomatic. So if I click on another country, depending on what country it is, I have different diplomatic options, but they're used to create these various diplomatic agreements, to offer trade agreements with foreign countries, to exert diplomatic influence on them, buy production licenses. So you need, I don't remember what the exact number is. I think you need 3 for a trade agreement, and some of the other options only cost 1 or 2. But basically, you do need to have a little reserve of diplomats at all times. You don't really want this number to be 0, but they're very cheap. It's very easy to spend. Put this at max for a couple days and gain a few diplomats. This is not. It's fairly easy. Spies are a little bit more expensive, and spies get killed by enemy spies. So spies are a fairly valuable resource. Officers are vital. You can see your officer ratio up here. Your officer ratio, basically, you need to have this at 100 to 140. Ideally, you just need to have this at 140% at all times, and that has to do with organization. It gives more organization to your units, and organization is probably the single most important statistic. We'll talk more about that later, but basically, when you are researching technology, you need to make sure that you're putting sufficient that your officer ratio is high enough when you start the war. So you need to keep in mind that even if it seems like you can be researching 16 or 17 projects as France at all times, you will need to keep in mind that at some point you're going to need to put some leadership into your officers, and we'll talk about when is the right time to do that and at a later point. Just globally talking about leadership, I just want to do a quick overview of the major powers in terms of how much leadership they have, leadership in IC and stuff like that, and resources in general. There are 3 countries that are leadership rich, that have a lot of leadership, and that have so much leadership that they can basically do whatever they want in terms of spending their leadership, and that is Germany, the United Kingdom, and the USA. They each one of those starts the game with about 30 leadership, with roughly, give or take, 30 leadership. If in terms of other major powers, there are 4 major powers that kind of have middling leadership, and those are France, Italy, Soviet Union, and Japan, and they all hover between, I think, 15 and 20 leadership. So they're not able to do as much research as the other 3 big countries, and they have to be very careful about having enough leadership for their officer ratio. And those are the 2 biggest things probably that you're going to spend leadership on in the game, is your officer ratio and your research. So Italy and Japan and the Soviet Union and France are going to have to be a little bit more careful with how they spend their leadership. And then, nationalist China, which I was saying is a major power, one of the reasons they need work at the beginning to become a major power is they start with fairly little leadership. I think they start with less leadership than any of the other major powers. I think it's something like 11 or something like that, or 12. I can't remember the exact number, but so that's something to keep in mind when you choose what country you're going to play. And in some ways, picking either Germany or the United Kingdom might be the easiest in terms of managing your leadership. And especially Germany. Germany, as it conquers countries, will gain a huge amount of leadership, in something like 50 when they've conquered most of Europe, and that's going to make picking technologies a lot easier for you. So that's just a good thing. In terms of IC, the world leader in IC is the United States. They start with something like 250, although they can't use all of it because of their laws. After the United States, in terms of base IC, the United Kingdom has, I think, the second most, if I'm not mistaken. No, sorry. Anyway, the United Kingdom, Germany, and the Soviet Union all have a similar base IC, but Germany starts the game with laws that allow them to have more available IC. France, and Italy and Japan all have significantly less IC than those big major countries. As well as, obviously, nationalist China has around, 50 base IC or something like that. And then minor countries have substantially less as well. So I think Romania and Canada both have something around 30 or 28 IC, things like that. So they do have a substantial amount of IC, but not as much. Poland has a fair amount of IC, for example. Yeah, so just something to keep in mind when you pick your country. The real industrial powerhouses of the game are the USA and Germany. The Soviet Union can become one. The United Kingdom has a very high base IC as well, and generally will not have too much difficulty in terms of having IC to spare. Countries like France and Italy and Japan are going to have to be a little bit more sparing with their use of IC, although all of the major countries have enough IC to do what they need to do, basically, especially if they conquer some neighboring countries. Right, so we've talked about all of the resources in the game. We've talked about how you can put those resources to use, what they're used for. Let's now talk about a few basic geopolitical concepts in the game. So I briefly mentioned Dissent when we talk about consumer goods. If you do not have enough consumer goods, you will accumulate Dissent, and what Dissent does is it decreases the efficiency of your IC, so it will make your projects take longer, basically. So you really do not want to have Dissent, and it costs quite a lot of IC to if I put 66 IC into consumer goods, it's only going to reduce this value by 0.8. So if you're not paying attention and you accumulate a lot of Dissent, it's going to take you a long time and many days of IC that's not going into things that are actually useful for you to get that value down. So you really need to make sure that value is as high as possible. All right, sorry, is 0 at all times. That's what I mean to say. You need to make sure that your Dissent is always at 0, and you need to put enough IC into consumer goods to make sure that that's the case. National unity. National unity is very important. This is basically the victory mechanic of the game. I didn't talk about victory conditions. They're not that important. They're pretty self-evident. But basically, I've opened up the victory VP map mode, which is the victory point map mode. Basically, if your national unity determines the point at which you will surrender. So Germany starts the game with let's just take a look here, with a national unity of like 90 or 100 or something like that. So I need to basically conquer all of their provinces, all of their victory point provinces, to force them to surrender. If I'm playing against Germany. France starts with this very low 34% national unity, because historically France had a very unstable political system before World War II, which is part of why they did not they were not successful in defending their country against Germany in the early stages of the war. So national unity will determine how quickly a country will surrender. It will also unlock certain laws here. Certain laws that are much more powerful and that allow you to mobilize more of your IC, to increase your manpower more quickly, and to basically build up for war. So it's very important to get this number up to at least 80 for all countries. 80 is a good yardstick. You should probably 80. There are events that lower national unity, so it's probably best to have a little bit over 80 in case you get an event that lowers it by 1 or by 2 or something like that. And we'll talk about how to do that when I talk about espionage. National unity is very important. Let's talk a little bit more about the diplomatic, the sort of basic geopolitical concepts that in terms of the diplomacy system in this game. So first of all, we can look at the diplomatic triangle. We can see here that the diplomatic triangle, there are 3 factions in the game, right? There are the Allies, the Axis, and the Comintern. Let's take a look at those 3 factions. So you've got the Axis starts with only Germany. Obviously, Italy will join the Axis fairly soon. The Allies are basically the United Kingdom and France and various puppets in the British Empire. So Bhutan, Iraq, Nepal, Oman, and Yemen, which those puppets are in the Middle East and in East Asia. By India, basically north of India. That's Nepal and Bhutan, which were basically kind of satellite states of the British Empire, more or less. And then Comintern, the Communist International, that's what Comintern stands for, starts with the Soviet Union, Mongolia, and Tuva. So that's the diplomatic triangle, and the way the diplomatic triangle works is that countries drift on this triangle towards one of the corners. So we can see that Portugal, for example, is mostly drifting toward the Axis, and there are a few things that affect that drift. One of the things is what political system you have. So I'll just briefly look in this. We can look at foreign countries' political systems in the espionage screen. So we can see, for example, that Portugal has a kind of fascist party or right-wing leaning party in power, and that means that they're going to tend to drift towards the Axis. So the drift is basically the direction that a country is moving, and there's various things that you can do to impact the drift of countries. We'll talk about that when I get more into detail about diplomacy. Another important concept is neutrality. Neutrality can be seen on this screen here. A very good way to look at your country's neutrality is to hover over the declare war button for any foreign country. The tooltip here will give you the most precise. It gives you the decimal point value of your neutrality, and if you're advancing time in the game, you'll be able to see most easily how your neutrality is decreasing. So neutrality, basically having a high neutrality prevents you from passing better laws and prevents you from doing certain diplomatic options like declaring war, proclaiming a guarantee, or embargoing. So generally speaking, universally in this game, when you start as a high neutrality country like France, one of your primary goals is to decrease that neutrality as quickly as possible. And Germany will starts at a neutrality of 60. Italy starts at a neutrality of 60. Japan starts, so the allied countries, the USA starts at 100%, as does the United Kingdom. So the allied countries have a lot more work to do to decrease that neutrality. Neutrality represents the degree to which the general population of a country will support going to war. And so it's very important. Another important diplomatic concept is threat. If we look at all of these countries, you can see there, we're seeing this from the French perspective. We can see what countries cause threat. Now, at the beginning of the game, there's basically no threats. But if we look at, for example, if we look at any country, we can see which country they find the most threatening. And we can see our threat to them and their threat to us, basically. Threat also affects what diplomatic options you are able to do, particularly declaring war. If Germany's threat to us is 10, we will be able to declare war on them when our neutrality is lower than 10. Basically, that's how threat works. As neighboring countries become threatening to you, your neutrality will decrease faster and faster. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. We'll talk more about diplomacy and threat and how you use threat to lower your neutrality in the video probably in one of the next videos. Another important concept here is relations. So if we click on our country, France, we can sort all of the countries in the world by relations, and the higher relations you have with a country, the better trade agreements you get, the more likely they are to drift towards you. So it's important to get a sense of the relations you have with various countries around the world. We can also, if we click on any other country, we can see what their relations are with other countries. So we can see that the USA has relations with all these Central and South American countries, decent relations with most European countries, and yeah. Basically, they start with zero relations with the UK, which is a bit strange actually, and Germany. But it's good to know what your relations are with other countries, and this is the best way to do that is to click around here, and here I can see. Let's take a more interesting country here. I can see, for example, here that Japan has it has a puppet state, but so it's 200 relations, obviously, but it also has very good relations with lots of other countries around the world at the start of the game. Italy has positive relations with both Axis and allied countries, and negative relations with Ethiopia, because Italy starts the game at war with Ethiopia. So just a good thing to keep in mind, and especially important when for trade. Relations are especially important, and you need to build up relations with countries that are resource rich if you are short on resources. So that's important. We'll get more into detail about that when we talk about trade. I think it's worth talking about some of the basic concepts behind the technology system in this game. So there are basically 3 types of knowledge in this game that make you better at researching technologies, and you need to understand this in order to understand how the production system interacts with the technology system. So there 3 or 4. Let's say there's 4 types of knowledge. There's theory. And theory allows you basically to develop new technologies. You use theory to develop new technologies. So if you want to build, better anti-aircraft for your ships, or you want to build better anti-tank weapons for your infantry, well, you need different kinds of theory for that. Infantry theory, militia theory, mobile unit theory, artillery theory, automotive theory, naval engineering, submarine engineering, aeronautic engineering, jet engine theory. All these green ones are theory. You also have mechanical engineering, chemical engineering, electronic engineering, rocket science, and nuclear physics. Those are all theory. You also have doctrines, which are in green over here. Doctrines are similar to theory in that doctrines are basically strategies that make your units fight more effectively, and doctrines are very, very important. We'll talk about them more in detail when I talk more in detail about technology, but you have a level of skill in certain doctrines. Then there's practicals. The blue ones here in these ones are practicals, and practicals basically increase the more units you produce. So if I go back briefly into the production interface here, I can see that if I produce one interceptor unit, you can see that I'll gain 2 practical from building that. If I produce, let's just set up a standard infantry division here. If I produce something like this, you'll see that I get, for every brigade, this is going to be 0.6 infantry practical and 0.4 artillery practical. So in some ways it's a very complicated system, but the basic takeaway here is that the more things you build of a certain type, the faster you'll research improvements to those types of units. And that's one of the coolest things about the technology system in this game, and it's an important thing to keep in mind. And I'll talk about how to best make use of that as we go along here. Another thing that impacts your technology is your combat experience, and most countries start the game with no combat experience. So land combat experience, naval combat experience, and air combat experience, which you gain mostly by actually fighting battles in the air, on the sea, or in the land. There are also a few technologies that will increase your land combat experience. There's no way to increase naval or air combat experience before the war. There are certain technologies you can research before the war that will increase your land combat experience. And now, what are all these used for? These are sort of your research resources, if you will. What are all these used for? They are used for increasing the speed at which you conduct research. So let's click on one of these, for example. Destroyer main armament. Well, destroyer main armament will be researched more efficiently if you have high naval engineering, destroyer practical, and fleet in being doctrine. And we can see that some of these are more important than others, though, because practical impacts the technology with 60%, while engineering only impacts it with 30%. So and the doctrine really only impacts it by 10%. Right. So, and if you get to know these, you don't need to memorize every single one of them, but if you get to know them, the basic interactions, it can help a lot in terms of practical. So, for example, building a lot of radar stations was probably not such a bad idea, even though the radar stations might not be all that useful, because it's going to very quickly increase some of these very important techs, like these techs, for example. Being able to research these techs quickly. So, for example, these techs, you get 70% impact from your electronic engineering practical. So it's important to understand the relationship between practicals and theories. And once again, to sum it up, the takeaway here is when you're thinking about what you're going to build, you want what you build to work in synergy with your technology. That's very, very important to keep in mind. If you don't pay attention to that, your research, especially for more difficult technologies, is going to be a lot slower. And you can see the difficulty level of a technology with this these numbers here. So aero engine is much more difficult to research than the small fuel tank. Small arms is very easy to research, whereas heavy tank technologies are much more difficult to research. And the same goes for doctrines. Some doctrines are particularly, like these blitzkrieg doctrines, are particularly difficult to research. So you may want to hold off until you get some land experience, or you may want to just anticipate that they're going to take longer. You can also see the year of technology, and generally speaking, and I'll get more into detail with this when I talk about technology, but generally speaking, you do not want to research things ahead of time, with a few exceptions. You can see here, as soon as I put in a 1938 tech, we get a little warning up here that says that that a tech is that you're not researching efficiently because the tech is more than 2 years out of date. So that affects the speed at which you research things as well.